Guten Tag, everyone. Welcome to another online lesson. Today we are going to be looking at the Berlin crisis, or Berlin 1, as we call it in class, the one that is not the wall. All right, there is no need to mention a wall in the 1940s. That is in the 1960s. Make sure, please, that you fully understand that. Berlin 1 is the aeroplane, the airlift, the blockade, and Trizonia. Okay, so with that little bit said, really important that we say it though. Let's get on to the first Berlin crisis and try and get our head around this relatively straightforward question. So where we are now in 1947 is quite clearly the Grand Alliance is on the ropes, okay? They work quite well together during the war, as we know, the common enemy, the marriage of convenience, but now we get into this little bit of tension in Berlin, which was always going to cause tension due to the fact that it's in the Soviet zone, which was agreed at Potsdam. But we can see from this map here, generally the Cold War course. And if you're watching this from year 11 and you're doing some revision, then you'll understand fully the two sides of this. If you're watching this for the first time because you missed the lesson, then this is what's eventually going to happen. We're going to split Europe east and west. And this first Berlin crisis definitely goes a long way to taking us to that point. All right, so let's get into the story. And then similarly to how we do with the Cuba story or any of the flashpoints really, where there are definitely three parts, a beginning, a middle and an end, we're going to focus this lesson on as if it's a narrative, as if we're talking ourselves through writing question 2, the narrative. So we'll need a beginning of the story, a middle of the story, and a nice logical end. The exam board want us to have a nice clear end that either is bad or good or whatever, but it's a clear and obvious ending to the story. So we're going to start obviously with looking at Bizonia, Trizonia and the Deutschmark and why that's led to tensions. Then the middle bit of our narrative will be the blockade, where Stalin blockaded the roads into West Berlin. And then the end of the story will be the US response or the Allies response, the Berlin airlift and the creation of West Germany. So that's the gist of where we need you to be thinking when you see Berlin 1 in your exam paper. Hopefully it will be a narrative. It could equally be a consequence, or how important was the Berlin blockade for international relations or development in the Cold War. Equally, though, it's much of the same thing. So let's get through this in terms of a narrative, and we'll try and point out throughout this online lesson where it could fit into a question 1, consequences, or more likely question 3, importance. Okay, so the question would be, write a narrative account of the Berlin crisis, 1947 to 1949. The bullet points would give you, I don't know, Trizonia and Berlin blockade. And they would expect you to put the third bullet point in, which if they're the two that they've offered us, then our third one would obviously have to be the airlift. All right, so the end. So they've given us the beginning and the middle, and then they'd expect you to add the third bullet point, the third paragraph, which would be the end. So we'll start the story in this lesson now with the beginning. As agreed at Potsdam, remember, Berlin, as well as Germany, would be divided into 4 zones. It was agreed at Yalta, of course, that it would just be Germany. And then as they got to the end of the war, in fact, they'd won the war at Potsdam, they decided, right, Berlin's a bit of a problem here. What shall we do about it? And they decided to split that equally, the same as in Germany, between Britain, France, America, and the Soviet Union. All right, so that is what it looks like. If you just take the time to look at this picture, maybe stop the video to really get your head around what's going on here. We can see that Germany has been split, French zone, US zone, British zone, all in the west, and in Berlin, or the eastern side of Berlin, of Germany, is the Soviet zone that Berlin just happens to be in. Don't forget as well from Yalta and Potsdam, in fact, that Britain was always a bit concerned with the Soviet Union's influence in Poland. Which is why it's quite clear, hopefully you can see from this map, that Berlin is really important to us as well, to be able to monitor really what's happening in Poland as the years of the Cold War go on. All right, so division was meant to be temporary, but ended up lasting for years. As we know, Germany was split right until the end of the Cold War. And that's because the breakdown of relations in the Grand Alliance sort of made it permanent. And that is how we're going to end today's lesson, really, with the absolute creation of East and West, certainly West Germany and East Germany, which then made it permanent, essentially, until 1991. The split between Britain, France and USA and the USSR is equal. The reparations that were agreed at Yalta and then confirmed at Potsdam, the $20 billion, they're going to come out of all 4 zones, even though, remember, one of the concerns was that the Soviet zone of Germany wasn't necessarily the strongest, it wasn't the most valuable, whereas obviously the British zone, remember from the Germany course, we've got the Ruhr, we've got the Rhineland. We've got all the industrial heartland. This is in West Germany, really. So there was that little bit of a debate, but generally speaking, all compensation will be coming out of all 4 zones. And of course, Soviet Union got 10 billion of the 20, so they kind of got a good deal out of that, I think. So the soldiers in the streets of Germany and Berlin, of course, monitoring and managing each zone. I suppose they're probably used to it, aren't they, having just come out of World War II with the Nazis in control. But essentially now, it's a little bit weird now for the Germans. It's not Nazis anymore, but there's soldiers from every other country within their country and in their cities and towns, especially Berlin. So the checkpoints are set up to obviously cross into from one zone to another, just like a normal car park, I guess. And the tanks and the soldiers, and it's all a bit sort of eerie and unnerving, but most people think at this bit of the story it's going to be short term. So the Soviet troops then start being a bit of a nuisance. They start holding up and searching all road and rail into West Berlin. Remember, we're supposed to be in this Grand Alliance still, even though the Grand Alliance after the Truman Doctrine is definitely on the ropes. And of course, Stalin has been sort of building up his buffer zone already. So there's a real tension definitely in the air at this first bit of the Berlin One story. Your job really is to make sure you're aware of that sort of backstory, that context to what's going on by the time this Berlin crisis kicks off in 47, that Stalin has been building up these countries that looks to the West, of course, that he's spreading communism west. That tension is there, and maybe that's why they do what they do in this first bit of the story. So this photograph shows you Checkpoint Charlie, one of the most famous parts of Berlin throughout the Cold War, the checkpoint into each of the other zones. So it's just a little bit of tension is really what we're talking about here. So in your first paragraph, as you're sort of telling this early bit of the story, you want to be trying to get across this little tension that's there. It's not full-on war yet. I wouldn't suppose at this point it's over yet, the alliance, but it's definitely on the ropes. So this page we're looking at here, this first screen, is just giving you a little bit of a context to what's going on in Berlin and why that's raising tensions all the time. This is a question that definitely requires you to be saying, this is raising tensions. All right, so this is what was going on. This is what the leaders are thinking about Germany. Now, there's a lot of change in the leadership by the time we get to 47. Truman is still there. Attlee is still there. And we've got Charles de Gaulle in charge of France. And, of course, Stalin. So let's just take a sec to get an idea about what they're saying, despite the fact what was agreed at Potsdam. Maybe they're sort of changing their mind a little bit, which, of course, as we keep saying, is adding to Stalin's frustration and his tension. So on the West, they want to help rebuild Germany and improve its economy. That's no different from Potsdam. That's always been their main aim, probably because they know that a strong Germany will be able to stop the spread of communism west, which is, of course, Truman's paranoia, that is what Stalin's trying to do. But, of course, Stalin would say he's only building these countries around the East as a buffer zone to protect them from America. So a bit tit for tat, a bit silly, really. But of course, this whole Cold War is based on that tit for tat idea, which could have ended humanity. And also, they want to remain in Berlin to try and observe what was going on in the East behind the Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill referred to. This Iron Curtain has descended across Europe, splitting East and West. So our paranoia, if you like, is kind of what's controlling this whole crisis, this whole tension, is that we just can't leave Berlin. In an ideal world, we'd let Russia have Berlin in their zone and we'd have a capital in the West, in West Germany. And then there'd be no tension and maybe no Cold War, and who knows what would have happened. But bit of ego perhaps, but also politically, as you've just seen in the previous map, Berlin is obviously really close to Poland, and it sort of gives the West a bit of an eye into the East. Whereas Stalin, he wants to take as much as he can back from Germany to help rebuild the Soviet Union after they were brutalized. A lot of the fighting took place in the East, on the Eastern Front. Remember Stalingrad and Operation Barbarossa, stuff like that. They also had the most casualties. And they wanted Germany to remain weak to avoid further German aggression. Very similar, I suppose, to Georges Clemenceau in World War I at the Treaty of Versailles. They're also a bit worried about East Berlin, would see the affluent lifestyle of the capitalists in West Berlin, and obviously they think that communism is rubbish. So that's really why Stalin wants the West out of Berlin, because he's just making communism look bad. And it is bad, but certainly when you look at how good life is in the West. So really what we're talking about here on this slide, this page, is kind of what we already know. Similar kind of discussion to what's going on at Potsdam. there's a bit of tension, but they agreed and they're sort of going to manage this thing and see what happens. However, in December 1947, which is probably where the start of our story begins, talks between foreign ministers of each of these powers, they broke down. All right, so the Soviet minister got really angry, stormed out the meeting, and that really probably is the symbol or the signifier of a breakdown of relations. Okay, so following on from the Soviet minister storming out, which you possibly probably need to include or want to include, unless you say three other decent things in your first paragraph, that is what's going to essentially lead to the West going, well, all right then, well, if you don't want to communicate with us, then we'll just go our own way. And that is what leads us on nicely to Bizonia and the uniting of the West. All right, so with the USSR no longer cooperating through their own choice, they got frustrated, they left. The Western allies decided how they're going to run West Germany. I say West Germany, Western Germany, because it's not officially West Germany until the end of this story. All right, so the British and the USA have combined their zones, in 1947 into Bizonia. All right, so 2 zones. That's what that would mean. Stalin is obviously fuming about this because at Potsdam it was agreed that all of Germany would be split equally, all sort of managing their own zones. Whereas this looks to Stalin quite clearly that the West are ganging up on him, onto the East. And that is where Stalin's paranoia is. But to be fair, he's not wrong. So this map here shows you now at Bizonia what Germany's starting to look like. The Soviet Union and certainly the Soviet zone is now surrounded, although you could argue that Stalin's got the Poland bit, which gives them some backup. But this isn't what they agreed at Potsdam. That's the point of all of this. Everything you need to be getting across in this, the reason for the tensions is because it's not what they agreed at Potsdam. And I sort of agree with Stalin on that one in this case. So if we go on a little bit, following that, in March 1948, the French then joined Bizonia and created Trizonia, which really, really, really upset Stalin, sort of pushed him over the edge, really. He could probably deal with Bizonia, but now they've joined Trizonia, it really is, the whole of Germany is Trizonia and his bit of Germany, and that totally isn't what was going on. And I feel like that might have been okay, but for this next bit. As you can see on the screen, those Western zones benefited hugely from the Marshall Plan money after the Truman Doctrine, where Truman offered or promised or threatened to stop the spread of communism no matter what, using military or economic. As we know, they gave $17 billion to Europe, whoever wanted it really, to try and stop them going communist. So the Western zones of Germany took the money, and of course, the economy improved, infrastructure improved, just really well. Very similar, I suppose, to Stresemann's Germany when he fixed it with the American loans. Whereas this time, the Marshall aid isn't a loan. It's just money. Just have it so that they don't go communist. So Stalin, of course, he's furious. This is where our attention goes. And this is what's going to lead you to paragraph 2 in a sec, which would be Stalin's response. And of course, you expect Stalin to respond, don't you? He feels victimized. He feels attacked. He feels ganged up on. And you can see from this map that the Russian zone of Germany is still very much now surrounded, apart from that little bit of Berlin in there, which of course the Americans are not going to be giving up for the reasons that we've just mentioned a little while ago. So whilst that's happening in Germany, the same thing happens in Berlin. And of course, now this is a problem for us because you've got Berlin split in 2, as you can see on the screen now, but Berlin is still surrounded by the Soviet zone of Germany. So in order for us to get our supplies to West Berlin, we're going to have to go through Soviet territory, which obviously is what this story is going to end with. And obviously, if you're revising, watching this as year 11, you'll know the kind of gist of what's going to be happening. We are going to have to go through Soviet Germany to get to West Berlin, to feed the West Berliners, to supply the West Berliners with medicine and things like that. So it's a really good opportunity for Stalin to do something about that, bearing in mind that he controls Berlin, or certainly Berlin is in his zone. That's where the tension rises, okay? So in June 1948, Trizonia then goes one step further, which really, really finishes Stalin off by they create their own currency. Now, remember at Potsdam, it was agreed that we would have one currency controlled in all 4 zones. So the Deutschmark essentially created this new super economic system in the West, and the East was poor, was not good. Communism wasn't good. So it created the second separate economic unit. And of course, now we've got two Germanys, West and East, and that was never part of the plan. And I suppose the reason why this is important is not really Trizonia in Germany. This issue is Berlin. That's what Stalin's upset about. He wants the West out of Berlin. All right, fine. That kind of makes sense. So the whole Cold War is now going to focus on Germany, really. Most of the Cold War focuses on what's happening in Berlin. I'm not mentioning the wall in this bit of the story because it might confuse you. Remember, there is no wall in this first bit. It comes later, but just to remind you that Berlin will play a huge part even later on in the story. So that's paragraph 1, pretty much done. We talk about Bizonia, Trizonia, and the currency, but we make sure that we keep saying this worsened relations because Stalin felt ganged up on, wasn't what they agreed, things like that. Make sure you get that bit in. So this is now what Germany starts off with, and this is what it looks like. Just to summarize this bit of the story, pause the video, get your head around these maps again, make sure it makes sense to you, and then when you're ready, let's get on to paragraph 2, or the next part of this Berlin crisis. All right. So paragraph 2 would be Stalin's response, which in this case, the middle of the story, is going to be the Berlin blockade. All right, so this whole second bit will be about the blockade. Stalin says it's never been more clear to him, the West are ganging up on me. He says, he's disgusted. I've obviously made this up in this little quote box, but the gist of it is there. We agreed at Potsdam what would happen, and now you're going against it. Stalin is essentially accusing the West of thinking that them together will develop West Germany and force the East into poverty. All very paranoid, really. But to be fair, communism, they're already in poverty because we know it's not good. This is the clincher, all right? And don't quote Stalin as saying this, but this is what essentially he's saying. He's not going to roll over for this. If you want to fight, you're going to get a fight. And I am now going to do something that's going to be a consequence of the Berlin, of Bizonia, Trizonia. So before we move on, if you're watching this for the first time because you missed the lesson, pause the video and in your book or your Google Doc, summarize what Stalin is essentially saying here. And if it is revision for you, year 11, just have a little think to yourself, essentially what he's saying, because you do know what's coming. All right, so when you're ready, come back to the video and we'll move on. So the western zones of Berlin are entirely surrounded by my Soviet zone, is what Stalin thinks to himself, which is, of course, useful. We've mentioned that a minute ago. So the two agreed routes into West Berlin are 2 land routes and 2 air routes. All Stalin needs to do is block those routes, doesn't he? That will cause lots of problems in West Berlin. So you want to be saying that in the opening bit of this second paragraph, that Stalin has got a plan, that he thinks that he can add or solve this problem and force the Americans out by stopping them supplying West Berlin. That's the gist of his plan, okay? And this is the Berlin blockade. Paragraph 2. So essentially, your content for this paragraph will look something along the lines of this. So in June 1948, there's lots of dates, as always. It's history, isn't it? Try not to get too worried about the dates. Just make sure that everything's in the right order that you're talking about in this narrative. It's got to be chronological, but don't get too bogged down. If you can remember June and April and all those kind of things, fantastic. If you can't, just make sure what you're saying is in the right order. So Stalin then straight away in June 1948 shuts off the land routes across Soviet-controlled Germany into West Berlin. Now, one of the things I often see when I'm marking exam questions on this or looking at your work in class is that you say Berlin, as it says on here. So let's take time to just remember, whenever we're talking about this story, we're talking about access to West Berlin. America, Britain and France have no desire to go anywhere near East Berlin, so that should never come into your mind. We are trying to supply our side in West Berlin. Don't ever worry about East Berlin, or don't get confused about East Berlin. Remember, we're trying to sort out our people in West Berlin. So this is kind of just to remind you where we are. We've got to travel through that red bit to get to Berlin. Why do you think Stalin thinks this might be a great idea? For year 11, you can hopefully remember the Cuba story in what Eisenhower tried to do with the not buying the sugar. He was hoping that that would turn the people against Castro. For those of you who are watching this for the first time, just pause the video and answer that question, why you think Stalin blockading the roads into West Berlin might be a good idea for him. And then when you're ready, come back and we'll have a little chat about why Stalin might be thinking that's a good idea. Okay, so welcome back if you've just done that task. Hopefully you wrote something along the lines of, he is hopefully going to starve the West Berliners so that they eventually get really fed up and they turn on the occupiers, if you like. They turn on Britain, America, and France and force them to leave. That's what Stalin is going to try and set up here. All right, genius, if you like it, if you think. So he's going to show them that a divided Germany won't work. That's what he's trying to show the Allies, because we're still in this alliance for now. Trizonia cannot work and be able to run without Berlin, and the West Berliners will soon run out of food. This will result in a huge propaganda win against the West, and they will have to give up their zones and go home and leave it to Stalin. That's his thought. Politically, I think that's a very good idea. It's a good plan, but what this now does is this puts us in a bit of a crisis. This second paragraph now takes a bit of a sinister twist. In what does the West do? You know, do they smash through this blockade, which is an act of aggression, which could obviously make this war hot? We'll see. We'll think about that as we go through in the next little bit. But Truman, don't forget, for context sense, has just issued the Truman Doctrine. He has just threatened Stalin that he will not stand for any spread of communism. He's promised the use of military and economic aid to stop this. He can't say those things in 1947 and then not follow through now in this first crisis. So Truman's kind of backed himself in a corner now. He has to act, and he's got to act decisively and aggressively, but also he's going to potentially lead us into a hot war. So that's really what this Berlin One crisis is all about. This bit now, what will the West do? Stalin is hoping they won't do anything, they'll just go. But we have got Truman in charge here. So pause the video and look at the table on the screen. Put advantages and disadvantages of the three options that you might advise the Western powers: to withdraw from Berlin, to supply West Berlin by the air and drive through the blockade, and of course the disadvantages of those three things. Again, you could just say disadvantage would be hot war, but try to add a bit more detail. It would show weakness, it would show a breakdown of the alliance. Add a bit more detail than just possible hot war. When you've done that, unpause and carry on with this lesson. All right, so hopefully you found that quite helpful, just to stop and think a little bit about why this thing is a crisis. And remember to be adding that into your Berlin paragraph, which now takes us up to the last paragraph, the end. The third bullet point, which is of course going to be all about the airlift, how the West responds to that. So paragraph 1, of course, just a little recap, was the creation of Trizonia, Bizonia, and the Deutschmark going against Potsdam. Paragraph 2 was Stalin's response to that. And in this case, now paragraph 3, the Berlin airlift, is going to be the West's response to Stalin's response. As we've said, very much tit for tat, but hopefully that can help you get your head around the content of this course, because most of the questions form a similar kind of process. All right, so Truman says, this is a dilemma. I know he's developing the atomic bomb. I can't be too aggressive, but I can't do nothing. We've just talked about that, especially following the Truman Doctrine. He will look very weak if he doesn't now follow through. So that's what we've just considered in the table. What should the USA do? This map really gives you a good idea about what's going to happen, okay? So we obviously can't go through the blockade because that will be an act of aggression, and that will basically give Stalin a free propaganda hit. Look at the West, aggression, forcing themselves on the West, exactly what we told everyone they were going to be doing. So we can fly in, and you can see the airports out of the three zones, into West Berlin and out. That's what's going to happen here, and that's what they're going to do, and that is the Berlin airlift, which essentially gives Stalin now the choice. The ball is in Stalin's court. What does he now do to the Allies flying over the Soviet zone? And if Stalin decides to shoot our planes out the sky, then of course we do have nukes. At the moment, Stalin is only developing nukes, but we do have them. And of course, Truman showed in 1945 that he's more than willing to use them twice in Japan. So keep all that in mind, especially when you think about the tensions of the Grand Alliance in this Berlin story. There's a lot more to it than just, oh, they've blocked the roads. There's a backstory. So what we do is we're going to fly our supplies into West Berlin. If Stalin is the aggressor, we now look like the victims, which is now propaganda's flipped the other way. Really, imagine living through this, and one day, you know, we're looking at this in the news, and the next day, Truman's the goodie and Stalin's the baddie. It's really quite silly, isn't it? All right. So keeping in mind, and these are the facts that you definitely should be including in this paragraph now, this third paragraph, that Berlin only has enough food left for 36 days, West Berlin. All right, that means the West Berliners are going to start getting hungry very quickly if the Americans don't get food and supplies in there. They also lack basic goods like medicine and fuel. So that is essentially what the priority is for the Allies in this airlift, is to provide West Berlin with the stuff that it needs before Stalin's wish comes true and the West Berliners get really angry and they start turning on the Americans. And of course, the airlift is going to do this. All right. So let's get some facts and a bit more content now for this third paragraph. I feel like we've got enough already for a nice paragraph. And I'll show you a bit of a model answer in a minute, but it might be worth you at the end of this page now, stopping the video and writing your own narrative based on what we've talked about. So you can see the photographs of the Berlin airlift. You can see how close the planes are. The children obviously watching. It probably was quite exciting in the West Berlin areas, waiting for these food to arrive, these boxes dropped from the sky. So here's some facts, okay? As always, in red means fact. We want to try and include these in our answers. Truman sends the B-29 bombers to Britain. They could now carry nuclear bombs. So America is essentially saying to Russia, watch it. Look what we can do. And also, as far as Stalin's concerned, he's worried that there are now nukes in firing range, okay, on these B-29 bombers. The airlift lasts 10 months. That's probably a go-to fact. You need to be saying around 10 months it lasts. And you need to be including coal, food, and medicine. All right, they're the bits that you definitely need to be including in this answer. There's a real risk as no one knew what Stalin was going to do. That's the tension that you need to be putting across in this third paragraph, that what Stalin potentially could do could lead to hot war. Always, always worsening relations, raising tensions. Remember, in this narrative question, that's the priority, the connectives and the tension words. So what Stalin does do, essentially, is tries to be a bit awkward. He puts some weather balloons up in the sky just to make it difficult for the planes to fly around. But he's not shooting the planes out of the sky. And America very quickly realised that Stalin is not going to be shooting no planes out of the sky. And it lasts 10 months. And the longer this thing goes on, the weaker Stalin looks, the worse he looks, and the better it looks for the West as far as a propaganda sort of victory goes. So the West Berliners and the Western troops in West Berlin, they build this new runway at Tempelhof. The airlift is a great success. Stalin looks really stupid. Russia looks stupid. Communism looks stupid. But he holds off for 10 months. The next sort of go-to fact that you really probably need to include in this third paragraph is about 1,000 tons of supplies are flown into Berlin, West Berlin, every day. All right, so Stalin then gives people the chance to leave West Berlin and move to East Berlin, and only 3% take up the offer. So altogether, overall, a complete disaster for Stalin and for communism. I feel like it's quite obvious, but we'll make the point in a sec, that this is almost certainly a win for the West. Just as a little nice aside, the pilots used to throw sweets out to the West Berliners, which is what that little picture of sweets represents to the kids as they flew over. Okay, so this map here, just before we move on, shows you the line at which where the Western tanks have to stop. They can't cross into Soviet zone because that will, of course, look like an invasion. So that's the aeroplane route that we've just looked at a minute ago. Okay, once you've got your head around that and you're happy with that, let's move on to summarize this. Our Cold War paper for Edexcel doesn't have sources, but our other papers do. So let's take a minute just to have a practice of some sources, really. Pause the video and make some observations on your Google Classroom, your Google Doc, or in your book, or whatever you're doing your revision on, what the message of these sources are essentially saying. They should be straightforward, hopefully. And then when you're ready, unpause and we'll carry on. So I would like to present to you that is 1-0 to the West. The first crisis of the Cold War, really, and the West has come out on top. Stalin's looking a little bit red. So let's see how we can draw this third paragraph to an end and end the first Berlin crisis. So in May 1949, nearly a year later, it was about 10 months this airlift was going on, Stalin gave up. He obviously finally bit the bullet, accepted the humiliation, and lifted the blockade. The West Berliners danced the night away in the streets. He looked weak, he looked stupid, and the West looked really, really good. West Berlin had shown that it can survive, even in the Soviet zone of Germany, but also the West has proven, unlike what Stalin was trying to prove, that Germany couldn't work divided. Well, they've proven that it can. All right, so that is really the end of Stalin's attempts to deal with West Berlin. Stalin's attempt to win this propaganda victory has obviously backfired, and the West had responded in a peaceful way, semi-passive aggressive, I suppose, but in a peaceful way, and it now looked really unwise and aggressive that Stalin did all this. He was the bad guy in this Berlin crisis. And that's really kind of the gist of the story. Humiliation for Joseph Stalin. And then finally, for this bit, after the Berlin blockade, it was clear the divisions of Germany would now continue. The Western Allies moved quickly to create a separate West Germany, which we'll talk about in a sec. That bit really is important for question 1. If you get one consequence of the Berlin crisis, then obviously the creation of West Germany and NATO would probably be up there, which we'll give you some detail about that in a sec. All right, so generally speaking, that's where we are. Tension's really high. Grand Alliance is very much now on the ropes. All sorts is going on. Obviously, the satellite states, one by one, the Truman Doctrine, and now this crisis, game over for the Grand Alliance. So the consequences, what we've just talked about, look like this. In the West, if we take it a bit by bit, the West is now known officially as the FRG, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany to everybody. Obviously, and if you're a football fan, or certainly your older people in your family, they'll know that for the next 45 years, one of the best international football teams was West Germany. They won a lot, and they were known as West Germany, a whole separate country from the East, which is bizarre, isn't it? Because they're both Germany. But here we go. That's what happened as a result of this. So Trizonia, just 3 days after the blockade ends, becomes West Germany, which in a way kind of, okay, Stalin's going to have East Germany. You think that would be okay. Remember that this blockade, this sort of partition of Germany was supposed to be temporary. It's now just got permanent. That's a big consequence of the Berlin crisis. In August of 1949, West Germans were allowed to elect their own parliament called the Bundestag. So democracy is prevailing. Democracy is going well in West Germany. And of course, it's not in East Germany because it's controlled by Moscow. So again, propaganda-wise, it's looking very good for the West and the West Berliners, and less good for the East Berliners. They created a capital, Bonn, which is in the northwest of West Germany. And of course, that would be the cue there for us to go, okay, you can have Berlin in East Germany, but we're not going to do that. And that's why Berlin continues to be a problem for the whole Cold War. So the 3 western zones of Berlin have now also become known as officially West Berlin. So a nice, easy sort of 4 marker there, unless you say that could be 2 marks, and then say the same kind of thing happened in East Germany, where the DDR was created, the German Democratic Republic. Ironic they use the word democratic in there, isn't it, with the Soviet control. So they become the DDR, East Germany. It's only a communist bloc countries that recognize it, though. And you'll see later in this course, if you're watching this for the first time, and for revision for year 11, remember Khrushchev's big sort of fight was to get East Germany accepted and acknowledged as a genuine, legitimate country. Everyone accepted West Germany, but no one in the West accepted East Germany as a separate entity, which is partly what Khrushchev, has the ultimatum for after the refugee crisis and later builds the wall. But okay, I think that's a little bit unfair. If West Germany is official, then so should East Germany. But that's not the point. The point is a consequence of this crisis is the creation of West and East Germany. A very, very straightforward question 1, I think. Just get that down. Get those 2 sets of bullet points into a little paragraph and get your 4 marks all day long. As we've just said, FRG refused to recognise this place until the 70s. During détente, they finally, when they're all working together and getting on okay, they finally acknowledged that East Germany is now its own country. Shame it took us to the brink of near human catastrophe before we do that. So then we'll look at the bottom 2 bits of this page now, NATO and then, of course, the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact is a few years later, so keep that in mind that this doesn't happen until 1955, so possibly might not be quite a direct consequence of the Berlin crisis, but certainly you could say it's in response to NATO being formed that the Soviets created their own version. So some facts about NATO is that this threat of Stalin to take over West Berlin and the potential takeover in Czechoslovakia has proven to the West, in their mind, that Stalin is spreading communism across, and it won't be long until it comes to Western Europe. So they've created this formal military alliance to protect them from the Soviet Union. Again, a bit of irony there. So NATO is set up in April 1949, just as this whole Berlin crisis is coming to a bit of a head. Possibly that's why Stalin ended the blockade, maybe. They also want to send Stalin a very clear message. They were determined to stand firm against communism, supporting and following up from the Truman Doctrine. Remember that. So Britain, France, and 9 other countries joined NATO. So you can remember that as just saying 11 countries, or Britain, France, and 9 other countries. You don't have to list them all. They've joined this. So we've now basically got essentially, officially, West Europe, haven't we? All of these Western nations in Europe have joined this new gang, this new team. They're going to look out for each other, they're going to protect each other, which basically guarantees that there will be no invasion from the east. Okay, that's the plan. And as we know today, if you're watching this at the time of making this video in 2025 with the whole Ukraine crisis and Putin, the whole point there, we think, is that Putin is very much trying to ensure that Ukraine never joins NATO. Because then there'll be a NATO ally on the doorstep of Russia, which is obviously causing them tensions. All right, so some of the agreements in a nutshell, okay, it's obvious. If anyone in NATO is ever attacked by anyone, then all members of NATO will come together to offer assistance. The USA might get involved in Europe, thanks to the Truman Doctrine, quite clearly has offered that help if ever needed. And there will now be a permanent American military presence in Europe. There still are today in every country. So that's the gist of NATO as a result, probably, of the Berlin crisis, because it was all a consequence of Stalin, his push west, wasn't it? So I suppose you could say it's his fault. He inadvertently has led to the creation of NATO. So the Warsaw Pact is very similar. When West Germany joins NATO in 1955, officially West Germany joins, then, of course, you've now got a NATO country right on their border, and Stalin gets really upset by that, or certainly the Soviet Union get upset by that at this point, and they create the Warsaw Pact, which is the same essence, okay? But all of the satellite states join that into the Warsaw Pact. They will be forced to look after each other if anyone invades a Warsaw Pact country. Obviously, that's much less likely than the other way. So the members of the Warsaw Pact are just the Eastern Bloc, the satellite states. And then, of course, the DDR, East Germany, joins the Warsaw Pact, which is why it's probably useful to do it at this point of the lesson. But that's where we are with this Warsaw Pact. There is absolutely no doubt now that there are 2 Europes. There's an Eastern Europe protected by the Soviets and a Western Europe protected by the USA. This is it now, folks. This is the Cold War, okay? Cold War is now official. Grand Alliance is probably now officially dead as well. So as far as a consequence question goes, this screen will help you with that. Maybe how important was the Berlin crisis for development of the Cold War? Well, of course, again, this screen, very similar to a question 1, full of connectives. This was critical because it led to, as a result of tensions rose, end of Grand Alliance. So very important, wasn't it? How important was it for international relations? Again, critical. So just always try and see these lessons in the Cold War as either question 1, 2, or 3. And question 1 and 3, as we keep saying in class, they're very similar. They involve connectives, they involve tension. The only difference really is that question 3 still requires connectives, still requires some tension, but you have to be really focused on the how important bit and what it's important for. All right, so this is now what Europe looks like after the crisis. There's no doubt about it. They are completely East versus West. Okay, you know that. You'll know that off by heart if you're watching this for the first time as we get through this Cold War course. All right, a bit of extra detail and info. I'm not going to necessarily talk you through that. It's just what we've just talked about, but maybe in a bit more of a concise way. That's kind of what you need to be getting your head around when you're describing the creation of NATO. All right, so hopefully now you could go ahead and write this narrative. If you haven't, as we've gone through, maybe stop the video and go and write your 3 paragraphs now, and then come back and I'll show you a sort of model answer. It's far from perfect, but you'll get the gist, okay? So when you're ready, unpause and we'll be able to have a little look at the 3 possible paragraphs. Certainly this will give you time to think about this in terms of the 3 sort of beginner, middle and end bit. Okay, so let's go. The first paragraph, you can read that yourself. Hopefully you can see where there are some connectives. Hopefully you can see where the ends. The first paragraph ends, kind of introducing what the next paragraph will be. Because we're trying to write a story, aren't we? We're trying to link our paragraphs together. We might call that chronolink, so chronological order, linking together. Hopefully we've got some facts in that first paragraph, but hopefully more than anything, you can see those process words, those intense words, those worsening relations words. That's what's important on this narrative. So that then links to paragraph 2, which is the blockade. Again, you're looking for connectives, you're looking for those intensifying words. And of course, if you can't see them in this very, very quick, brief narrative that I've written, add them. Look at this one and make it better. All right. Remember, you are limited in time. You can only write what you can write in about 14 to 18 minutes, depending on how quick you are with the other questions. So we're not after perfection. The examiners aren't after perfection, but we do need to make sure we're getting our facts in and we're making it really clear what's going on. And then our third paragraph, of course, is going to be the airlift paragraph, with the facts are quite obvious. 1,000 tons. You can see the facts. Maybe look at this and write down where I've used facts or where you think I could have added better facts. I've got the 10 months. And remember that paragraph 3 is the only slight difference from the other two is it's got to have a logical ending. Okay, so the story that you've written, the narrative account, has to be a bit of a logical ending. So have a look at this one that I've showed you here. Look at the one that you've just written if you did it. And if you are in year 11 and you haven't written one but you see this one, see if you can reproduce that in 12, 13, 14 minutes and then hand it in for your teachers to mark. Or as I say, even better, if you think it's not very good, fix it. Add the connectives, add the intensifying words, and then let us know what you think about that too. All right, but that definitely is a good overview of this bit of the story. All right, so a little revision exercise if you want to do this. Obviously, ask your teachers for the copy of this storyboard, but you can make the storyboard yourself. For all of history, storyboards are great because we're all about chronology, aren't we? Events happening. But for the Cold War course, because everything is based on impact and consequence, this is one of the best ways that you can revise for a Cold War topic. So on the screen here are the bullet points of everything that's happened in this Berlin crisis. And you can obviously turn that into a storyboard. In the arrows, I might ask you to put some words like connectives in there to practice that. This led to, as a result, consequently, or some of those intensifying words. And of course, then dual coding in the big spaces on your storyboard will be the pictures or images that reflect or respond to the text. I genuinely think that's probably the best way to revise the Cold War stories, all of them: Cuba, Berlin 1, Berlin 2, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. They all have this same theme, don't they? That they are a series of events. So this will help you do that. You can make your own storyboard up, but if you want copies, speak to your teacher and we'll be able to supply them for you too. All right. And then a little summary of the Berlin 1 crisis before we finish. So remember that all lessons are on our website at stchistory.com. Remember as well that there is no wall in the Berlin First crisis. Just try and remember that if there's an aeroplane involved, which there is, the Berlin Airlift, then we're not talking about walls, okay? The wall is John F. Kennedy. Remember, he says a wall is better than a war. If there's no mention of John F. Kennedy in the story, then there's no mention of a wall. Whatever it takes you to understand that this first Berlin crisis should not mention a wall. And then equally, the second Berlin crisis should not mention an airlift or supplies of coal and food and things like that. All right. So with that said, thank you very much, as always, for listening. Hopefully this was helpful in getting your head around the Berlin story. If not, as always, let your teachers know. And we'll be with you in the next video. Okay. So thank you very much.